For centuries, many women were persecuted for the crime of witchcraft. What is your true story? We always have the idea that they are going in your shoes flying. What was said was that they invoked the devil. They will also present it with a physical aspect that will inspire us fear and even repulsion. The witch is the most controversial character in mythology. His legend had consequences in the lives of thousands of women. We have always had a negative idea of the witches, but it should really be explained. What is really a witch? By witch, if we are purists and we go to the dictionary of the Royal Academy, it would be that woman who makes a pact with the devil to have extraordinary powers. The term witch is a relatively modern term, appears in the 13th century, begins to popularize in the 14th century, which does not mean that there would be no witches previously, but they had another name. Until then there was sorcery, sorcerers. There have always been women who through a series of pacts had power over their surroundings to the point of making curses and making spells. They were the first rituals of humanity. The slugs to prehistoric times. Why is the woman who has always been the representative of magic? Because the magic that she creates cannot be done by men, it is life. We create impressive structures, ships, buildings, but at no time we will give life. A woman itself, yes, curiously. Because parthenogenesis is possible. That is, from an ovule, you can create life, but you can never create life from a sperm. In Altamira's caves, archaeologists have revealed that the role of women was greater than they thought. They identify that the famous sorcerers who in the caves made the cave paintings and the incisions were not such men but that it was the women who made them. According to the studies, at least 75% of the printed hands are hands. These communities were matriarchal, led by women. But 10 years ago, everything changed. The man is no longer a hunter to be a farmer. At the time that man does not need to move to hunt and can be settled in a place, the woman loses that function that had previously caregiver of the offspring and maintaining somehow of the spiritual essences of the tribe, and those passed to the man thereafter and change the role of patriarchy. A model that continued to harden over the centuries. The woman has always been or almost always subject to the male, subject to the priest. They openly face a patriarchal society. Ecclesiastic, in which the father god is magic, being hidden terrain, is the place where she can empower, where she really has the pan by the mango, where she really becomes queen of magic, queen of the night, queen of the moon. In monotheistic religions, God always related to the power of the sun. However, magic is always associated with the night, with the moon and the woman. The moon always marks the rhythm of the woman. Every 28 days we have the menstrual cycle. We sanction every 28 days. But the power of the moon affects us all. All beings are related to the influence of the moon tides. We are a 90 and both water, with which all our flows are also influenced by the full moons, by the avenging moons. Invocating the forces of the moon, the nature was sought to alter, it does our magic. This opposition between sun and luna, day and night, religion and magic, is the one that makes the woman who really reigns in this magical kingdom. But before monotheistic religions, women who practiced magic were already known as Medea. Like Circe in the Greco-Roman world, the Mapuche tribes had a Maki that was the great, the sorceress. But the word witch was not used. When does the concept of witch appear then? It arises with Christianity, invents or creates the figure of the demon in which the witch is associated as a servant of this demon. For the witch to exist there must be a pact with the devil. And for this pact to exist, the devil must exist. With which, if there is no devil, there is no witch. The church saw magic as a rival to its authority. But in the villages, many people continued to believe in the ancestral power of some women. Although the three of them do magic, really on a scale of goodness, say, first the healers would say that as their own name says, they cure. It was that woman who knew the therapeutic properties of plants to do good, that is, to cure. Then there would be sorcerers, who are ambivalent, can do good or evil, depending on your client and what they pay. Then there would be the witches, that it is the sum of evil. It is the one that always does evil because it has made a tacit or express pact with the devil. The pact with the devil is what makes the sorceresses of the witches that have it signed, and therefore with those that the Inquisition is more overwhelmed, for example, because having a diabolical pact would also be heretics, and that is when they go for them. It was the beginning of one of the most bloodthirsty episodes in history. The witch hunt. What were the true reasons for this persecution? We had to look for a scapegoat to many of the evils that were happening in Europe at that time. We are talking about times of famines, epics of plague, people died and the cause was not very well known. And then it was known that there was women, normally marginalized from society, usually single or widows, which, well, were reputed to sorcerers, that occasionally, they made their spells to benefit or harm someone or something. The belief of whether you had a nephritic colic was that a witch had he took away the pain of childbirth to the woman who was giving birth and had thrown him to another person. A feeling that if he put hand to these types of women, the evils that were ravaging a society would disappear, they would disappear. These superstitions led to a real genocide. The starting pistolet by that witch hunt that lasts neither more nor less than 3 centuries begins with an octave innocent bull of 1484, where it is already said that there are women associated with the devil to make evils, commit infanticides, causing bad harvests, or simply that the animals are dying. Worst of all is that 2 years later there is a treaty called the Maleficarum, translated as the Hammer of the Witches, written by 2 Dominicans, quite PSI company mockery and quite misogynist, which was Sprenger and Kramer, where they are giving reasons, principles and elements of how to detect a witch, how to hunt it, so that these types of evils that are ravaging a certain society disappear in way to definitive. But this foolish plan was not the work of a few. Here theologians, magistrates, kings, potatoes were involved, that is, the thinking people, the intellectually more prepared people, are the ones who fell into the insanity, in madness. Make a witch persecution, normally to women, simply for totally superstitious reasons and for poorly founded theological reasons. Between the 15th and 18th century, more than 50 women were sentenced to death by witchcraft in Europe. More were imprisoned and tortured. Although in principle, the crime of witchcraft was also applicable to men. Following the inquisitorial documents, the Cars of Faith, many more women appear than men who are dedicated to these needs. Of course, the question is why there are more causes against women than against men, when there is also talk of sorcerers who also had the same reasons they will be prosecuted. The answer is found in the first pages of a book. The woman denigrated her, even in theological treaties, thinking that what Eva did in paradise, look, we have to go back to Genesis, because that generated a whole sin that fell to the female gender. It was thought that women were more susceptible to being deceived by the devil and holding man to also take him to his fold. That is why 80% of the judgments that were made both in the Catholic world and in the Protestant world were women. This misogyny was common thinking for centuries. Once the witch hunt was launched, new professionals appeared. The witch hunters existed. In the inquisitorial documents, we found the figure of Pedro de los Reyes, the witches hunter of Extremadura. Era de Llerena, a native of Llerena, and dedicated himself precisely to detect a mujeres that he believed they were witches based on a mole that had in the rabad, or to look at his eye and have the pupil maybe a little dilated. Everything could be an excuse to associate those women with the devil. Having 6 fingers, any physical deformation, was synonymous with witchcraft. Justice many times asked questions. The Inquisition simply with listening to the witch hunter already gave her. From that moment they only had to obtain a confession. The Inquisition dungeons were the most feared place by the people. The executioners had refined all kinds of torture. The most used were the foal, where you could break arms, legs. You could find the torture of the touches, where they also threw you into the poison tied hands and feet. They put a gauze in your mouth, they put a funnel and began to throw distilled water. Building can burst, because you could not expel the water. And the Inquisitor told you, have you really practiced witchcraft? Tell me a yes, closing his eyes. Thino, open them. Was it true? It wasn't true. The Inquisition decides. The best had really done absolutely nothing. It had already been a false complaint, but under torture, you or me, they put us in the colt and we sing everything that has to be singing. What torments could be extended for days, weeks, until the body endured. We also have the pulley. That would be the garucha they called him, right, where they tied the river with their hands, they raised it and then dropped it without touching the ground. In those places, acts of greater cruelty were allowed. There was only one rule. What could not be done was that the body of the inmate effusion blood, and that must be very clear, because sometimes we visit the museums of the Inquisition and there we find practically a very high number of torture that produce bloodshed. That is not Inquisition. That is civil justice. The witches were not only convicted of the Inquisition. In the courts of the provinces, hundreds of women were adjusted. In those dungeons the greatest atrocities were committed. It was said that there was an area of the woman's body where the devil normally put his hand to make the sign of vassalage, and that insensitive area. The executioner had to find that exact point to demonstrate that it was a witch. After 200, 300, 1,000 punctures, the woman was no longer learned if she punctured her once or not. So all were witches. These terrible practices extended throughout Europe. By Germany and in England the woman was taken and asked to hold an iron bar to read during the time of Our Father. Then the wounds were made, he was set, he had it guarded, and if in 7 days he did not heal, it was witch. Many women did not come out of the interrogations. The witch hunt is a stain that still weighs in the conscience of humanity. a term that is still used in cases of unjustified persecution, and that it should only be remembered to prevent it from producing. Witches are associated with a term. Calar is a Basque word that means the meadow of the goat. The witches were increasing their knowledge and there they practiced all their spells. The Aquelarres are surrounded by mystery. It is difficult to separate the truth from the legend. We find these ceremonies described in the inquisitorial acts. According to the chronicles, in locations such as Cernegola, in Burgos, these ancestral rituals were practiced. What are scientifically created by the Aquelarres? Remains of pagan traditions, previous even to the Romans, de fertility. These women kept some of the oldest rituals of humanity alive. These fertility cults, which can be trunk even with a Neolithic origin, in the sense that the woman is Mother Earth and therefore there is a link between the two. The Church could not allow it. In the documents of the Inquisition there are details of a mysterious figure that directed those ceremonies. A half-man, half-beast. What could it represent? Obviously someone has to preside over that. Christ, a virgin or God cannot be presided over. This is the goat, because the male cabrio through the horns, that is, there we have to overcome the pagan gods like Cernunnos. In Celtic mythology, they were always associated with the tectonic entities of nature, which with Christianity everything that had horns and had a tail, they become a devil. The Catholic Church did was demonize the ancient gods. That is, the concept of the devil as with goat and horns legs is an image that can be any of the roasted gods, Cernunnos, bread. What did these animals have to be the object of worship? Well, the deer, the bull, the goat, the animal has always been a representative of the wild force of life. When they put the image to the ancient witches and said, that is the devil, they said, of course, it is worth, yes, I love the demon, because for them he was not a demon, it was his god. He was the god of nature. Many of the PROC's inquisitorials are considered to be idolaters because they do not worship the true God but would worship in this case the goat. For example, Lucifer is still nothing more than Venus Luciferina, who is the carrier of light, the more convenient ways of representing the demon. That Jewish concept of the devil means the antagonist but does not shape it, does not give it in any aspect, but for people to reject the ancient practices, they say that the ancient gods is the demon. In the interrogations about the Aquelarres an incredible event was narrated that would end up being part of the collective imaginary. We always have the idea that they are going in their hides flying. That women were sworn to have been able to fly. What really happened in the affliction? The answer is found in the forest. The witches were the great connoisseurs of the power of plants. What are power plants? Obviously those that have the capacity to generate a state of alteration of consciousness. Valenio and Estremonium were known for their hallucinogenic effects, although they were dangerously toxic plants, as they could not eat directly, but to absorb it through the mucoses, what they did in making an ointment that rubbed into a broom. They took the bruise stick was the softer stick in the house, the wood, for the use, for having been handled. They spread it from a series of funny substances, including black Valenio, which has, among other things, LSD. And they had a great time between the legs. Until entered the 18 there are no panties. So you have the legs. The substance entered the organism and I assure you that you flew. That is why it is said that witches flew in a broom. These altered states of consciousness were interpreted by the inquisitors as the result of diabolical pacts. However, the cult of the Prince of Darkness could have been really practiced by other women. The Inquisition condemned the witches to agree with the devil. Most were false accusations, but not all, and they signed in the most unexpected place. They have studied real cases of nuns who worshipped the demon. What led those women to take that path? Want to leave the convent? That is, here in Spain, until very recently, until practically the 19th century, the first child of a marriage had to be a friar or cure. And if she was a child, she had to be a nun, because that gave the family. And from there you find that 3-year-old children are in the convents or girls of that same age also within the convents. When they are 13, 14, the vocation as such does not appear and what they want least is to be in that club. They want to get out of there. For them, precisely, they do the opposite to what they entered. The cross is imposed, they are going to take other paths, they will agree with the demon. He was the Prince of Darkness. What really meant the devil? At the etymological level it comes from diabole, that is, from what separates you, it demolishes you. Does it clear what? Of divinity. Then everything separative is diabolical, unlike the symbol that comes from simole, which is what unites you. In the monasteries the power of God was studied, but also the devil's power, and some members of the clergy were tempted by that power. They are really the only ones who can agree with the demon in a truthful way. Why? Because the great grimoires, the great magic books, which were prohibited by the Inquisition, often reached the convents through certain friars that were precisely responsible for making them disappear, burn them, but they did not burn them, but they kept them and bring them closer to certain convents. And of course, there were women and men who, within the cenobios they agree with the demon and write the covenant with their own blood. I, guide from such, give my soul to the devil in exchange for pleasures, favors, wealth. These pacts were continued ceremonies in honor of their new dark lord. A remedy, a mockery, a parody of the Christian Eucharist. The cross is invest, there is a desecration of the sacred hosts and then to end in a banquet and in an orgy. In the inquisitorial acts we find several cases of satanic nuns. One of them happened in 1743 in a town in Navarra. The nuns of Sorceresses were a group of 14 nuns, of which 6 were satanic. They had two behaviors. The satanic, on the one hand, in the moments that were interested. But when they were with the other nuns, they proved to be more Christian than anyone. It is one of the best documented cases and we found names and surnames. At the head was Mother Agueda, who was the group's leader. The nuns wrote a pact with Satan seeking to obtain special pleasures and powers. His mission was precisely to act in favor of the demon for that pact that they had done. From then on, those nuns did the opposite of what their votes ordered. They left the convent at night to practice fornication. This was equivalent to the fact that these nuns were pregnant. Not only with people from the street, but also with masons who came to do works to the convent and friars themselves and friars who also came, confessors of them. And from there you find that all the children born in the convent. These nuns murdered him, directly drowned them, because for them what they were doing was the devil's seed. The children also buried them in the orchard of the convent. They had a gardener who had already previously notified that they did not end in the place where those flowers were sown, which were sacred flowers, holy, that they themselves sowed. When the Inquisition entered the rag against these nuns by denunciation of some of the other nuns who realized what was happening, the tortury once they torture the nuns, they say where the fetuses are, really everything they had done. Baby contempt, that is, the Grisacon who made certain ointments to heal wounds, say they healed for their own skin. The event of the nuns of Sorceresses is one of the few cases where the pacts with the devil could have been true. And however, the event was not discovered until this day. Sorceresses never learned what happened in the convent. Because the honor of the habit had to be safeguarded. Therefore, the Inquisition would never have a show of these nuns or take them out to each also to be publicly prosecuted. But in the same Navarra, out of the monasteries, the most remembered witchcraft trial in the history of Spain occurred. Zugaramurti. Even today it is known as the people of the witches. A principios of the 17th century there was the most infamous case of witch hunt in Spain. What did it really motivated to come to light all this sect, of sorcerers that there were? Well, denunciations of certain children, especially, who were the ones who accused these women of having taken them to the affliction where the witches danced, they carried their dresses, they crushed them to remove the liquid inside, with that liquid according to these children, they smeared their areas of the body like the sobacos or the parts of the legs to fly. The descriptions of these children arouses the fear between the people and soon, for all the people, began to tell spooky stories. They come to accuse these women of going to the cemeteries, of taking certain pieces of corpses, of legs, of arms, to roast them in grills, eat them, but what really produced this wave of accusations? The Vatican gave indulgences to those people who denounced others. Therefore, you in a Sunday in Mass you could hear the Edict of Faith and that Edict of Faith told you clearly that if you see people practicing some kind of superstitious movement, come to report them. People believed that they could be saved and could arrive before heaven if they denounced certain people, and this was the order of the day, with which many people were denounced falsely, as could be the case of these witches who may not really even practice witchcraft at any time. Zugaramurti's accusations ended up arriving at the Holy Office. The Inquisition takes those complaints and will begin and look with magnifying glass what is really happening there, because there is no accusation of 4 or 5 people, but they get to accuse more than 1,000 people. After an interrogation and torture process, 11 women were sentenced to death. They are going to be 5 alive, the rest will be burned in bones, because they had died in the prisons of the Inquisition. What happened when a person died in the prisons of the Inquisition? The body gave it to the family. The Inquisition had a cemetery where these bodies were buried and the day the car of faith was going to be held like this of Logroño of 1610 the bodies of these witches were unearthed. He was made a pelele, a cardboard doll that would put the corresponding San Benito, the capirote and the habit and a sign in the chest with the name of the witch, the heresy he had committed and the year in which he was going to be prosecuted. And, when they reached the burner after finishing the car of faith, and they had tied to the strips of the Inquisition, in the sticks, in the rings, to those live witches to be burned, the bodies were thrown into the bonfire and after them the pelele that represented those witches who had died in the prisons of the Inquisition or under torture. Hence, we see in Spain that anthropological tradition of parties where peppers are burned, dolls are burned, the relationship is over here. The case of Zugarramurdi in 1610 was the worst act of barbarism committed against the Brujas in Spain. But in other countries horror was much greater. When we talked about Inquisition and the different crimes that the Inquisition pursued, the Inquisition, the Catholic Inquisition from the Protestant Inquisition must be distinguished. In Spain, the Catholic Inquisition condemned the bonfire to 59 Bruges. But this figure validates compared to other countries. In Europe and specifically in Germany, that is, a Protestant Inquisition, there were 25 executions for the crime of witchcraft. The Holy Spanish Office discovered that the sentences against the witches were not as profitable as those applied to their other great enemy, the Jews. Because those who had the pella, what they had economic power and purchasing power were the Jews and especially the converts of Jews in this case, right? That were condemned by the Inquisition or the Judaizers, those who Judaized hidden, using the bedrooms of their homes as if they were true synagogues. There were people who had 500 heads of cattle, had 3 or 4 houses, vineyards, colmenares, and that was wealth. And the Inquisition requisitioned, confiscated all the assets of those people, one part would go to the real treasury, and the other would go to the Inquisition. However, the Spanish Inquisition still has a reputation for having been the deadliest against the witches. Why, however, we carry that black legend? Well, there is a fundamental reason, because it is the Inquisition that takes more to abolish. Here the Spanish Inquisition, because of Fernando VII, is very late. It is not until Fernando VII dies that he dies in 1833 and especially with the regency of Maria Cristina when he disappears the following year. That caused us tremendous damage because the enemies of Spain always associated with the Inquisition because all the evils that were the bloodthirsts and here we were killing heretics and witches continuously in Spain we were bloodthirsty with other types of crimes and victims, but not so much with the witches. In the 18th century, the witch hunt came to an end. He is a lonely person who normally lives away from society and also practices black magic. This black magic in what will it be translated? Well, in the elaboration of spells, of poisonous potions, even in some cases they will present it as a cannibal, right? Since he will devour those innocent children who approach their chocolate house. In these stories, the witches represent ugliness and evil. As an old woman, with warts, with even a little greenish complexion, with dark and somewhat tattered clothes so that children when they see them because they feel that repulsion, not even those beings, but we should not forget that they are very powerful and that through those spells and that black magic that they practice, they can change. We can find them transformed into the most beautiful animals or women of enormous beauty. Why does the witch's character appear inside the stories? It is a warning for children. Do not to fees from strangers. For very good words, they have, however good they appear with you, or for many gifts that can make you, they are not trustworthy, then careful to trust you with those strangers. At present, fiction witches are no longer what they were. There has been a social change. Modern lamenting points towards gender equality. The witches that present us the current fiction, whether literary or either audiovisual, point to a young witch, in many cases almost adolescent, which dominates magic but that will exercise magic for good and not for evil as before. These new witches are rebellious. They are brave, they are fighters, they are independent and face both these forces of evil and also in many cases against the dominant patriarchy, becoming authentic feminist icons. And in the real world, the witches continue to exist. There is a current that is called the Wicca in which they are considered heirs of those ancient traditions of witchcraft. In fact, they call themselves the old religion. Wicca is a religion. It is a mystical and initiatory religion that worship nature. Originated in the United Kingdom at the beginning of the 20th century, Wicca has spread throughout the world. They are a set of pagan beliefs based on the origins of witchcraft. Cis practicants claim to perform magical acts and supernatural invocations. You have to be received in a coven, you have to be received in a group where you are given the initiation. These coven are the direct evolution of the ancient aquelarres. It is our spiritual family, they are the people with whom you share the most ineffable moments of your life, the moments where you are doing magic. However, despite being the same witchcraft, its members had to change their name. Why? Because people, before a word like Wicca, have no prejudices, while with the word witchcraft it has many prejudices. 90% of people what they know about witchcraft is what they see in the movies. It will go to the cliches, it goes to what they have told, which is witchcraft, before asking, well, what is that really? Maybe in the witches we can see an aspect of the mythology of what is the lack of understanding when we do not understand something and react negatively. The myth of the witches is precisely that of their evil. And these legends have not been ate on time. Despite all the ills suffered, the witches have never disappeared. Submissious presence leads us to accompany us from the origins of humanity.